What she whispered next would change everything. "Can I borrow this blanket, bud?" Here's what she didn't know. The man she was asking, he owned the very place she'd been sleeping in for months, but wait until you hear what happened next. This story will restore your faith in humanity, but first let me take you back to where it all began. Winter in Chicago hits different when you have nowhere to call home. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees. That February night snow was falling harder than it had all season, and for 19-year-old Sarah Martinez, this wasn't just another cold night, it was potentially her last. You see, Sarah had been living on the streets for 8 months, not by choice, never by choice. Her story started like so many others, a family crisis, mounting bills, and a series of unfortunate events that left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a determination to survive. She'd found refuge at the Northside Community Shelter every night. She'd wait in line with dozens of others, hoping there'd be a bed available most nights. She was lucky, but this night was different. The shelter was at capacity again. "Sorry, honey," the volunteer had said, her eyes filled with genuine sadness. "We're completely full. Try again tomorrow." Sarah had heard that word so many times it had lost all meaning. So there she was, huddled in the doorway of a 24-hour laundromat, watching her breath form clouds in the frigid air. Her thin jacket, the only one she owned, was no match for Chicago's brutal winter. That's when she saw him, man in his late 40s, wearing an expensive-looking wool coat, walking down the street at 11 p.m. He wasn't walking like someone in a hurry. He wasn't looking at his phone like everyone else. He was observing. His name was David Chen, though Sarah didn't know that. Yet what she also didn't know was that David had been walking these same streets every night for the past 3 years, not because he had to, because he chose to. David stopped when he saw her, not the way most people stop, with that uncomfortable hesitation before quickly looking away. He stopped with purpose. "Rough night," he said, his voice gentle but not pitying. Sarah looked up, immediately defensive. She'd learned that most conversations with strangers fell into two categories: those who wanted to help for 5 minutes, then disappear, or those who wanted something from Harriam. "Fine," she lied, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely get the words out. David sat down on the cold concrete beside her, not close enough to make her uncomfortable, but close enough to show he wasn't going anywhere. He pulled out a thermos from his bag. Steam rose from it as he opened it. "Coffee," he offered. Sarah stared at him. In 8 months on the streets, no one had ever just sat down with her, talked to her like she was a person, not a problem to be solved or avoided. She accepted the coffee. It was perfect, not too hot, not too sweet, like he'd made it specifically for someone who needed warming from the inside out. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Then David did something unexpected. He started talking about the neighborhood. "See that building over there?" He pointed to a red brick structure across the street that used to be a factory in the 1920s, made typewriters. "Can you imagine hundreds of people coming to work every day, building the machines that would write the world's stories?" Sarah found herself actually listening. When was the last time someone had told her something interesting, something that wasn't about her situation or her problems? "What is it now?" she asked, surprising herself. "Apartments, expensive ones. Funny how things change, isn't it?" As the night grew colder, their conversation grew warmer. David told her about the history of the neighborhood. Sarah, almost without realizing it, began to share pieces of her own story, not the dramatic parts, not the tragedy, just life. How she'd always loved reading, how she'd been studying to be a teacher before everything fell apart, how she missed having a place to keep books. "Books are heavy when you're carrying everything you own," she said with a small laugh that held years of pain. That's when David did something that would change everything. He reached into his bag and pulled out a soft wool blanket, not new but well cared fourth kind of blanket that had clearly been loved here, he said, simply offering it to her. Sarah stared at the blanket. It was beautiful, deep blue with small silver threads running through it, but more than that, it looked expensive. "Real, I can't take this," she whispered. "Why not?" Because it's too nice, and I don't know you, and I don't know when I could give it back." David smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from a stranger in months. "Then don't think of it as taking, think of it as borrowing." Sarah's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for weeks. The kindness was overwhelming, but she'd learned to be cautious even with kindness. She leaned closer to him, her voice dropping to barely a whisper, as if saying it too loud might make the offer disappear. "Can I borrow this blanket?" David nodded. Of course. What happened next neither of them expected. As Sarah wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. She felt something she hadn't felt in months. Warmth, real warmth, not just from the blanket, but from the simple act of human kindness. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to repay me," David said. "But can I ask you something?" Sarah nodded. "The shelter you mentioned? Northside Community Shelter. You've been staying there when there's room?" Sarah replied, "It's a good place. The volunteers are kind. I just wish." "What do you wish?" "I wish there were more beds, more space. I see the same faces turned away every night. Good people who just need a warm place to sleep." David was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked another question. "If you could change anything about the shelter, what would it be?" Sarah thought carefully. This wasn't hypothetical to her. This was her life. "More blankets like this one," she said, pulling David's blanket closer. "The ones they have are thin. They try, but people are still cold. And maybe a place where people could keep a few personal things, a book, a photo, something that reminds them they're still human." David listened to every word Sarah, he said quietly. She realized she'd never told him her name, but somehow it felt right that he knew it. "What if I told you that changes could be made?" "Say, that's nice in theory, but change takes money and time and people who actually care enough to make it happen." David reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a business card. Sarah took it, squinting to read it in the dim streetlight. Her hands started shaking, not from the cold. This time the card read David Chen, Executive Director and Founder, Northside Community Shelter. Sarah stared at the card, then at David, then back at the card. She couldn't finish the sentence. "The person who opened the shelter 3 years ago," David said gently, "and I'm the person who's been trying to figure out how to make it better every day since." The silence stretched between them. Sarah's mind was racing. "You own the shelter. I founded ID, run it. Every night for the past 3 years I've walked these streets because I needed to understand what happens to the people we can't help, the people we turn away." Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around her. "So you've been walking around looking for people like me, people like us," David corrected. "I wasn't always the guy with the nice coat and the thermos of coffee." "Sarah, I was homeless too 15 years ago. Different city, same story. I slept in doorways like this one. I waited in lines for shelters that didn't have room. I asked strangers for blankets." Sarah's eyes widened. "One night someone sat down next to me, just like I sat down next to you tonight. He didn't lecture, medn't try to fix me, he just sat with me, treated me like I mattered. What happened? He helped me get back on my feet, not with money, with time, with respect, with the belief that I was worth investing in." "When I finally got stable, I made him a promise. I promised that I'd do the same for others. The shelter, it's that promise kept. But every night I turn people away. I feel like I'm breaking it again." Sarah was crying now, not from sadness, but from something she'd almost forgotten existed. "Hope." "The blanket," she whispered. "My first night off the streets, the man who helped me gave me a blanket, not this exact one, but one just like it. I've carried one with me." David stood up slowly. "Sarah, I have a proposition for you." "Okay, keep the blanket. It's yours now, but I want something in return." Sarah's defenses went up slightly. "What helped me make the shelter better? You know what it's like to need these services. You know what works and what doesn't. You know what dignity looks like when you have nothing. I don't understand him offering you a job part-time to start helping me redesign our intake process, our sleeping arrangements, our whole approach, making sure we're actually serving people the way they need to be served." Sarah stared at him. "You're offering me a job. I don't have an address. I don't have references. I haven't had a real shower in 3 days. You have 8 months of experience in exactly what we're trying to address. You have insights I could never have, and you have something else. What? You still care enough to worry about other people even when you have nothing. That's the most important qualification for this work." 3 months later, Sarah Martinez was living in a small studio apartment 6 blocks from the Northside Community Shelter, not because David Chen had given her charity, but because she'd earned it. Her first suggestion had been simple: give everyone a small lockable box where they could keep personal items. The second, replace all the thin blankets with warmer ones funded by a local textile company that David had approached with Sarah's insights about what people actually needed. The third suggestion had been the most important: train all volunteers to sit down when they talk to residents, eye level, person to person. Within 6 months, the shelter had expanded into the building next door. They weren't just providing beds anymore, they were providing dignity. Sarah had become the assistant director of resident service. Her job was simple: make Sure, everyone who came through their doors was treated like a human being first and someone who needed help second. 1 year after that cold February night, Sarah was walking the same streets David had walked, not because she was homeless, but because it was now part of her job. She was carrying a thermos of coffee and a soft blanket. That's when she saw here a young woman, maybe 22, huddled in the same doorway where Sarah had met David. Sarah sat down beside her. Rough night, she said gently. The young woman looked up, defensive and scared. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out the thermos coffee. As they sat together, Sarah told her about the neighborhood, about the old typewriter factory, about how things change, but also about how some things, kindness, dignity, hope, remain constant. The young woman began to relax, to talk about books she missed reading, about dreams she'd had to put aside. Finally, Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a soft wool blanket, deep blue with silver threads. Here, she said simply. The young woman stared at Heidi. Can't take this? Then don't think of it as taking. Sarah smiled, remembering. Think of it as borrowing. The young woman leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. Can I borrow this blanket? Of course, Sarah said, and when you're ready, maybe you can help me make sure others can borrow one too. Sometimes the most profound changes start with the smallest gestures: a cup of coffee, a warm blanket, a willingness to sit down beside someone and treat them like they matter. David Chen started with one shelter and a promise to pay forward the kindness he'd received. Sarah Martinez started with nothing but became the person she'd needed when she had no one. The Northside Community Shelter now serves over 300 people every night. Have never had to turn anyone away since that expansion. 5 helped over 2,000 people transition into permanent housing. But if you ask David or Sarah what they're most proud of, they won't mention the numbers. They'll tell you about the blankets, how every person who comes through their doors gets to borrow a real one, warm, soft hand, given with dignity. They'll tell you about the small lockboxes where people keep their treasures, the books, the photos, the reminders that they're still human. Most of all, they'll tell you about the volunteers who've learned to sit down when they talk to residents, eye level, person to person. Because here's what David learned that night, what Sarah learned 3 months later, and what that young woman would learn in the months to come. We're all just borrowing kindness from each other, and the only way the system works is if we keep passing it forward. The next time you see someone who needs help, remember Sarah's whispered question, can I borrow this blanket? The answer should always be yes. What small act of kindness could you share today? What blanket, literal or metaphorical, could you offer to someone who needs it? Sometimes changing the world starts with changing one person's night, and sometimes that person changes everything in return. If this story moved you, please share it, not for views or likes, but because someone in your community might need to hear that they matter, that they're worth sitting down beside. That dignity and hope aren't luxurious, they're human rights. And if you're currently struggling, please know your story isn't over. Your whispered questions deserve answers. Your need for warmth, physical and emotional, is valid. There are David Chung's and Sarah Martinez's in every community. Sometimes you just have to be brave enough to whisper, can I borrow this blanket?